again. This is Brian Baugh, creator of Wulf and Batsy. Back with you for another issue commentary. This time for issue 2. Now, again, as I explained in the issue 1 commentary, I created Wulf and Batsy way back in 1999-2000 and drew these first few stories back then. But the book got picked up by Alterna Comics in 2021, actually. And in order to present it in a new way for this Alterna series, I had to create new covers. So for the issue 2 cover for Alterna, I knew it had to be something very action-oriented to reflect the contents of the story inside. So here's Wulf in all of his glory, slathered in the blood of his victims. And then we have Batsy doing this very interesting thing where she's pulling her eyeball out and shoving it right at the reader. And I'll explain more about that whole eyeball situation when we get into the issue. This cover was a very simple composition. Basically, I had my two characters in the foreground, and then this tree. It was just a big black zigzag, really. I don't know, something about when I was drawing it, I just felt the energy of just going, right down through the background of the drawing. Got a little covered up by the logo there, but it just felt right to have a violent, abstract shape in the background like that. To just emphasize the action. But then, when I was going to color it, I realized that left some of these areas pretty open. So what I actually did was, if you see these faint shapes of trees back here along the edges, that's actually a photographic element. My father has a huge forest in his backyard, and I just basically went out there one winter day and took a picture of the dead trees with all the leaves gone in the freezing temperatures, and took it into Photoshop, knocked the opacity way, way down, and just kind of put it back in there just to fill in those shapes. And I think it adds a lot to it. I think it really helps that cover. You gotta love a girl who can rip her own eyeball out. Inside front cover is a title page illustration, a drawing I did way back when. And we're picking up the story right where we left off in the last issue, with Wulf surrounded by these angry villagers, featuring Rolfo Jenkins, the meanest bartender in the world. And this is, of course, in the classic tradition of Universal monster movies, which I'm a diehard Universal monster movies fan ever since I was a little boy, watching them on TV on Saturday afternoons with my dad. I was a kid of the late 70s and early 80s. I was 10 years old in 82, so I grew up right smack in the middle of the rise of George Lucas and Steven Spielberg and Stephen King novels and of course the 80s horror movies. And I have to say, one thing that all of those things have in common is story pacing, which really got into my DNA as a comic book creator, I think, in terms of my sensibility of telling stories. Because if you look back at the early Star Wars movies and Spielberg's early movies like Jaws and Raiders of the Lost Ark and the early Stephen King novels, too, it's all about build up, payoff, build up, payoff. The slasher movies of the 80s were the same way. Nightmare on Elm Street. It was always the whole story was always this cycle of building up and then paying off with big action. Salem's Lot is like, I think that book is really in my DNA as far as storytelling, because the entire first half of the story is setting up this town and all the people who live there, and it's very slow paced. But man, once the vampire action starts, it just takes off like a rocket. And that's kind of where I get my sense of pacing. And so if issue 1 was the build-up, issue 2 is definitely the payoff. So of course, I'm just reveling in all this bloody, gory action with Wulf slaughtering these villagers. Wulf's design was basically inspired by the movie The Howling, which I think has just the coolest looking werewolves ever. Designed by Rob Bottin in that movie. And also Cycle of the Werewolf, which was a Stephen King book illustrated by Bernie Wrightson that I also had. It came out when I was in the 7th grade. And Wrightson's werewolves in that book were very much like the werewolves in The Howling. And Wulf's design comes very much from that. So, of course, I'm just having these guys get killed off in all sorts of fun, interesting ways. He just punches through this guy, and then in the next panel, he's holding his heart, which is still beating. One inking technique that I just love is splatter. It's so much fun to do, where you take a toothbrush covered in India ink and just flick it at the page, and then you take a straw and you just blow through it and spread out all these bloody lines. And it just makes the most organic looking splatter effects. I love that when you're using ink that way, because the ink is so liquid and it's so alive, and it's so unpredictable in terms of what it will do and the effects you can get. I love this guy getting his arm bitten off. Right through the gut. We cut back to the Psalm Hotel, where Batsy has just woken up and she's emerging from her bath in all her glory. And as she looks around her room, she realizes that Wulf is nowhere to be found. Then she sees the note and realizes that he went out. And she is aghast, because they are monsters and they have to live with their heads down. They have to keep out of sight. So Batsy's looking out the window, and of course she's worried about him, which I think is kind of humorous and endearing at the same time. The idea that Wulf is out there just slaughtering these villagers, and she's worried she's worried about him being out there all alone, and what if he's lost and afraid? She could never forgive herself. I think that's kind of part of what makes Batsy cute and endearing, is that she's such a little mother sometimes, Okay, so here we go with this moment where she rips her eyeball out. Splicked. Pulls it out, got a nice long gross optic nerve there. And then she releases it, and she has this dialogue that she speaks. It's a little bit translated, and it's a little bit made up garbly-gook. It's translated from the ancient Draskilese. This is a sort of mishmash of real information and made-up nonsense. I'm a huge collector and reader of any kind of books that are filled with old legends and supposedly true stories of vampires and werewolves and other traditional monsters. And I believe I did read the word Draskilo in one of them, which has something to do with the crossing over from life to undeath. And this whole notion of her pulling her eyeball out, this is a ancient belief. A species of female vampire called the Lamia, who could pull their eyeballs out and send them out to do their bidding. So that actually does come from folklore. I didn't just make that up. And of course, Batsy has a fun little endearing line of dialogue here where she says, she's thinking to Wulf, and she says, "Wherever you are, I just hope you're not causing any trouble." And then, of course, we go immediately to this page where he's just ripping a guy's face off. Here we get the reactions of the villagers, and of course, Rolfo Jenkins has no sympathy whatsoever for his friends. He's like, "Where are you going, you cowards? He's killing us, Rolfo. We got to get out of here." And there's that head literally bouncing down the hill. He's like, "Don't let up on him. There's still a fighting chance," as this guy is getting swiped by werewolf claws and his jawbone literally flies off. This is a dumb joke, but I like it. Rolfo Jenkins says, "It's not over yet. We've still got 3 good men left." Crunch. Make that 2 good men. Slash. Well, okay, 1 good man. Ugh. So cutting back to Batsy, some of these real simple backgrounds here, these little quaint villages. At this time when I did this comic, I was young, and one of my real weaknesses was doing backgrounds and villages and buildings and things like that. But around this time, I discovered a comic book series called Evil Eye by Richard Sala, and he had a backup story in there called Peculia that I just loved. And it was drawn very simply, but very stylish. And he had these scenes where Peculia is walking through these quaint little haunted, spooky villages, and just the way he did the buildings was kind of liberating for me. I found this comic with the perfect timing when I was struggling with this stuff. And once I saw the way he did it, I was just like, oh, that's so simple. It can be so easy if you just get over insecurities and just do it. So that was a big inspiration for me. I love Richard Sala. Of course, this is the girl from the opening scene of issue 1, who ran into Wulf and Batsy there, and Batsy hypnotized her. And she recognizes Batsy and says, "There she is. That's the witch I told you about." She's using the word witch because she hasn't seen any evidence that Batsy's actually a vampire yet. Here's Freddy Krueger over here in the crowd. So the young peasant girl, Sandy, says, "Quick, grab her before she casts another of her wicked spells and gets away." And sure enough, Batsy casts one of her best spells. She turns into a mist. Again, this is like the eyeball thing, where it's like, it's not a power that I really feel like I see people use very often in a lot of horror comics with vampires. It was used very effectively in the movie Fright Night, which is one of my all-time favorite horror movies. Came out in '85, and I saw it as a kid when it came out, and just loved that movie. And it makes such clever use of a lot of the old-fashioned vampire powers and abilities and things like that in a modern setting. And they did some cool stuff with vampires transforming in that. And so I just always thought of that, like, yeah, doesn't it make sense if the angry villagers were going to try to catch a vampire, couldn't they just turn into a mist and get away? But yeah, it was really fun to draw Batsy in these weird shapes, having turned into this cloud of mist. Had fun doing this little old-fashioned water well here, just to give more of that quaint feeling to this environment. Once they figure out she's not a witch, she's a vampire, this guy says, "Helga, bring the garlic." And here's the garlic. I don't know if this old lady is actually Helga, but it might be. And he says, "We bind you with garlic, and the power of the garlic actually makes her transform back into her normal shape." And Sandy says, let's tie her up. Somebody says, "Helga, bring the ropes." And then they tie Batsy to a tree, and this guy says, "Make a magic circle and seed it with salt so she can't get away." And then this guy says, "Helga, bring the salt." So, I don't know. I just think it's funny, the idea that somewhere in this town there's this unseen character named Helga, and whoever she is, she has to do everything around here. So this guy comes up. "I'll chop her head off." Sandy says, No, wait. Let's have fun with her first." So we realize that this poor little peasant girl is actually a lot more sadistic character than we thought she was. And she puts the garlic right on Batsy's face and burns off half her face. You know, I'm a real equal opportunity comic book creator. I feel like, if the guys can get hurt, the girls can too. And this guy has a silver dollar, and he chops it in half. And he starts shoving the silver dollars down the barrel of his rifle. He says, "Ready for you now, werewolf." So he thinks he's got a rifle loaded with silver. Another setup. We will pay that off later. Back to Batsy. She's tied to a tree now with half of her face burned off. And they're gonna kill her. But then in flies the eyeball. Plunk right in her face. Sandy turns around. "What the?" And then Wulf appears and immediately just whoosh, slashes Sandy to death. He didn't split her open, really. He just kind of shredded the flesh, and all the subcutaneous layers and fatty layers just kind of poured out. And then we have a nice shot of Wulf going, ready for more. "Who's next? Who's next?" Rolfo Jenkins steps through the crowd. He's got his rifle loaded with silver. Now, this idea, when I was in college, I read this graphic novel. I think it was Tell Me Dark. I might be misremembering that. But I think that's what it was. And he had a scene in there where some guy loaded shotgun shells with coins and started firing them. So you'd have these like giant shotgun blasts. So it would just rip people to shreds. As soon as I read that, my immediate thought was, now hold on a minute, that wouldn't work. More likely it would blow up the barrel of the gun and blow your fingers off. So I immediately decided to do that in a story. And that's what happens to poor old Rolfo Jenkins. And here he is with his hands blasted to smithereens. and he's looking at them. And I love this kind of reaction. You see this in war movies a lot, I feel like, where somebody gets hurt in some horrifying, grisly way, and before they start screaming in agony, they just have this moment of looking at their own demolished, destroyed body and just going, like, they can't even believe that, no, this couldn't have happened to me, right? Could this really have happened to me? Oh my God, it has happened to me. And then they start screaming, right? And then she has another one of those lines from Draskalees. Always like the way she looks right here. That's a good look for her, honestly. And then she sucks his blood. And at this point, you know, I think the villagers are pretty much done. They've seen enough. This is an important detail. Because she sucked his blood, his body is just emaciated now. She's quite pleased, wipes her little chin, and she says, if nobody else wants to die, please go home now. And there's another important detail here where she chops his head off. Because if you don't chop his head off, he will come back as a vampire, and she does not want that. Well, so much for this town. What's left of it. And I must add, I think there's something kind of romantic going on here. If you think about it, it was Sandy that was really bullying Batsy, and it was Rolfo Jenkins who was really out to get Wulf, and yet they killed each other's bully. Wulf killed Sandy, and Batsy killed Rolfo. There's something sweet about that. And then we have a page of ads from the Captain Bloodclot Company. They're literally selling dead fish. X-ray glasses, one of the classic novelty items. There's this ad for a really interesting looking book. I'm kind of curious about this one myself. I Fell in Love with a Deformed Freak. The true story of the bikini model who found love in hideous, unnatural ugliness. Well, you know, hey, if it works for them, it works. This ad, grisly selection of horror comic books. Man recently jailed on multiple grave robbing charges must sell entire collection of horror comic books in order to make bail. Please order soon. Actually, that was me. I asked the Captain Bloodclot Company if they could put that in there for me. I had to call them from the jail to get that ad copy figured out and put in there on time. But I was able to make bail, and this is no longer relevant, so don't call the number. You won't get anybody. So that's Wulf and Batsy issue 2. The second half, the payoff of the We Have No Home story arc. Let me know if you like these videos. Tell me what you think in the comments. It's kind of fun to go through these issues and tell you guys what was going on in my head when I was making these goofy monster comics. And if you guys like them, I'll do another one. We'll jump into issue 3, which is the start of the Bizarre Experiments story arc. And I have a lot to say about that one. So, all right, leave a comment, like and subscribe if you would, and see you next time.